The Royal Heritage of Clampton. Come and listen to a story about a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer who barely kept his family fed. And then one day, while he was shooting at some food, up through the ground came a bubbling crude oil that is black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed is a millionaire. The kinfolk said, "Jed, move away from there." They said California is the place you ought to be, so they loaded up the truck and removed to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars, the Beverly Hillbillies. The morning sun was shining bright over the sprawling mansion when Jethro Bodine came bursting through the door, wearing an outfit that could only be described as something from a historical pageant. He cried out with great enthusiasm, "Oinks and tally-ho, my liege, Sir Junco de Bodine, at thy service." Jed Clampett looked up from his porch chair, completely baffled by the sight of his nephew parading around in velvet bloomers, a ruffled collar, and a rather peculiar hat. Jed shook his head slowly and asked, "What has got into you, boy, and what is that you got into?" Jethro grinned from ear to ear, gesturing proudly to his costume, explaining that this is the kind of royal raiment he is going to be wearing over at your castle. Jed blinked in disbelief, scratching his head as he uttered, "A what?" Before Jethro could answer, Ellie Mae and Granny came walking out to see what all the noise was about. Jethro did not lose a beat and asked if Mr. Drysdale had called yet, declaring that Jed had done inherited the doggone castle over to England. Jed laughed softly, thinking it was just another one of his nephew's wild imagination pieces, and told him to go on, but Jethro insisted it was true, describing it as one of them grave big rascals with a moat and a drawstring. Granny looked at Jethro with absolute skepticism, asking if he was agreeing with her, but Jethro shook his head and said, "No, sir, I was over at the bank when Mr. Drysdale got the word, so I went over to the studio and got us some Queen Elizabeth clothes." Jed repeated the name in surprise, "Queen Elizabeth," and Jethro nodded eagerly, saying, "Yes, sir, she's a Queen of England. I looked her up in a book, and these are the kind of clothes you got to wear around her." Jed asked if anybody had to wear them, and Jethro clarified that it was just us royal folks, pointing out that the specific outfit he had on was worn by Francis Drake. Jed examined the strange velvet garments and murmured that he hoped it looked better on her, which caused Jethro to correct him quickly, stating that Francis Drake was a man, a fighting man, a sailor. Jed chuckled and noted that any sailor running around like that better be a fighting man. Just then, Granny came marching back into the room looking for something, asking Jed if he had seen her things, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Jethro's outfit. Jethro immediately took on a very formal posture, bowing deeply and saying, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am. I did not know that you were here." He then turned to Jed and formally introduced himself as Jethro, Sir Jethro, head Bartlett to His Majesty the Earl of Clampton. Jed looked at him and said, "Jed, what is this?" But Jethro looked shocked, telling Granny that you do not call him Jed because he is royalty and she is just a commoner, one of his oaths. Jethro insisted that Granny had to bow and scrape and grumble in front of Jed, and in front of him too, because he was the royal nephew. Granny was not about to take that kind of talk from Jethro, so she reached for a piece of leather, causing Jethro to jump back and beg Jed to give him that piece of leather and not let the old woman hit the boy. Jethro complained loudly, asking if Jed would let her hit him, and declared that he would have her thrown in the dungeon like that because oaths do not run around hitting members of the royal family. Granny waved her hand dismissively and said, No, sir, no. No." But Jethro warned her that now she had done it, and she should just wait till the queen hears about this, because she had done laid her hands on his royal person. Granny snapped back, telling him that if he did not get his royal person into some decent clothes, she was going to lay more than hands on him. Jed stepped in to keep the peace, explaining to Granny that the boy is excited, and he got a hold of some story about me inheriting the castle, so they should just listen to what he has got to say. Granny crossed her arms stubbornly, declaring that she ain't listening to no nut that runs around in velvet bloomers and wears a woman's hat. Jethro defended his wardrobe, saying these here is royal raiment, and this here is what the queen favors for her nuts, to which Granny retorted that what she sleeps in is her own business. At that moment, Jane Hathaway arrived at the house, looking for the family, and Jethro immediately welcomed her by saying, "Ah, Miss Clousey, I just found him." Miss Hathaway looked at him in total confusion, asking if that was really Jethro under all that velvet. Jethro turned to Granny and introduced Miss Hathaway as Miss Newtonberry, his royal maid, loudly commanding Granny to bend her knee to His Highness, next of kin, you Saxon dog. Granny stood up straight, her eyes snapping with anger as she asked, "What did you call me?" Jed saw that things were getting out of hand and tried to calm his nephew down, saying, "Now hold on, Jethro." But Jethro turned to Jed and argued, "But Uncle Jed, it is true, I mean, sire, she is just your mother-in-law. She ain't blood kindier like Ellie and me." Jethro went on to explain his understanding of English history, claiming that makes her a vassal, and she has got to do our bidding and walk 3 paces behind us. Jed shook his head, telling him that is nonsense, but Granny surprisingly smiled and said, "No, no. That is all right, Jed, I do not mind walking behind Jethro." Jethro grinned with satisfaction, saying that is more like it, Maeve, and added that when they stretch around the castle, she will bring up the rear. Granny raised her hand with a leather strap again and asked if that was bringing up enough, or if he wanted another one, sending Jethro scurrying backward. Ellie Mae came running into the room then, full of excitement, asking what Mr. Drysdale had said. Granny replied that he was on his way over and confirmed that Jed had indeed inherited himself a castle. Jethro jumped up and down, shouting, "See, I told you," and told everybody to get into their royal ring quickly. He then bowed to Jed, saying, "After you, old man," as they prepared to meet the banker. Meanwhile, back at the Commerce Bank, Milburn Drysdale was walking around his office in a state of absolute euphoria, talking to himself about how fabulous, how completely fabulous this whole situation was. He could see it all perfectly now, the presentation to court, being knighted, taking a seat in the House of Lords, having luncheon with the Prime Minister, and having tea with the Queen. Miss Hathaway, who was watching her boss spin his grand illusions, pointed out gently that Mr. Clampett is hardly prepared for such honors. Mr. Drysdale stopped and looked at her like she was crazy, clarifying that he did not mean Jed, he meant himself. He declared that he would handle things just like he does here, meaning the Clampetts will stay at the castle, while he will be up in London receiving the honors and banking the money. Miss Hathaway asked what money he was talking about, and Mr. Drysdale explained that it would come from the tenants who live on the 10,000 acres surrounding the castle. Miss Hathaway urged him to be cautious, telling him not to get his hopes up too high because if she knows Mr. Clampett, he may decide not to go to England at all. Mr. Drysdale looked shocked and asked what she meant, insisting that Jed has got to go, and that he himself has got to go because England is his kind of country, and that is where he wants to live. Miss Hathaway then posed a difficult question, asking what would happen if his wife, Mrs. Drysdale, did not want to go. Mr. Drysdale shuddered at the thought but tried to remain positive, while Miss Hathaway reminded him that the way of royalty is not the way of the Clampetts, as they are plain, simple country people with no grand desires. Back at the Clampett estate, Jethro was still trying to enforce his new royal rules. When he saw Mr. Drysdale and Miss Hathaway arriving, he turned to the family and whispered that this could help, before shouting out, "Quiet, peasants, the commoners is here." Ellie Mae came down the stairs wearing a beautiful gown, asking Jethro how he liked her castle dress, and if it was pretty. Mr. Drysdale entered and smiled, saying it was beautiful, but Miss Hathaway quietly murmured that they do not actually wear that sort of thing anymore. Jethro ignored her and yelled, "Quiet, commoners," before complaining about the front entrance, saying, "Doggone, when you hear someone knocking at the door, you're supposed to let down the door string." Mr. Drysdale looked at Jethro in bewilderment and whispered to Miss Hathaway, asking how you housebreak an oath. Jethro, thinking he was doing a great job, declared that he had got her oaths closed and everything, but she won't grovel, where shucks. He then called out into the kitchen, "Hey, Oath, come on in here." Granny walked out, looking completely exasperated, and told Mr. Drysdale that Jethro says if she does not grovel, the Queen is going to throw her in the Tower of London and feed her to the beef eaters. Miss Hathaway immediately stepped forward to clear up the confusion, stating that the idea was absolutely preposterous. Jethro pointed at her and told Granny, "See, I told you," But Miss Hathaway clarified her statement, saying no, I mean that there is a general misunderstanding about modern-day England, which she shall clarify, without further ado. She addressed the old woman directly, saying, Granny, there is no certain, you are not an oath, and Jethro, even members of the periods no longer have the power to rule the lives of others. She then turned to the young girl and said, and Ellie Mae, these costumes are strictly for pageantry, and there is no desert prison, no torture for those overdrawn at the bank. Mr. Drysdale frowned deeply at his secretary and snapped, will you stop putting England down? Granny looked relieved and asked, you mean the Queen ain't going to feed me to the beef eaters? And Miss Hathaway smiled and said, of course not. Granny immediately turned on Jethro with a furious glare, shouting, why you? Which made Jethro panic. He backed away, claiming that Miss Jane had committed high treason against the crown and cited an oath, warning Miss Hathaway that her head is going to roll. Granny told him he better hang on to his own head too, but Jethro held his ground, shouting, don't you touch me, or the royal executioner will lop off your offended memory, adding proudly that he was the head baller to His Majesty, the Earl of Clampett. Mr. Drysdale, eager to find the man of the house, asked where the Earl was, and Jethro pointed upstairs, saying he is up in the turret putting on his royal raiment. Just then, Jethro looked up and saw Jed coming down the stairs, calling out, hey, Pa, we got company. Jethro quickly corrected himself, saying no, not like that, and changed his tone to a formal announcement, saying, by your leave, sir, 2 vassals beseech your audience. Jed, however, was not wearing any velvet. He was in his regular clothes and called down that he ain't coming down wearing these fancy duds. Mr. Drysdale rushed to the bottom of the stairs, pleading, oh, please, Mr. Clampett, I mean your lordship, grant us a boon. We humbly petition your royal presence. Jethro joined in, urging his uncle to come on down, and Jed finally relented, saying thanks, Pa, and walking down, though he muttered that this wasn't my idea. Jethro cheered, shouting, hot dog, now you're going to see some class, all hail His Majesty, Earl of Clampett, and then turned to Granny, commanding her to kneel. Oaf, yes, kneel, oaf. Mr. Drysdale waved his arms frantically, saying no, trying to stop the madness. Later that afternoon, back at the bank office, Mr. Drysdale was pacing back and forth, completely furious with Miss Hathaway. He accused her of trying to ruin his life, wreck his career, and shatter his dream, shouting that he had got the Clampetts all steamed up to go to England and claim their castle, and she had destroyed everything with her big mouth. Miss Hathaway looked at him calmly and asked if he was raving about the fact that all she did was tell the truth. Mr. Drysdale yelled back that is exactly what he was raving about, acknowledging that while she knew he considered this a great financial opportunity for himself and his bank, she should think about the Clampetts for a moment. Miss Hathaway paused, and after a mere 2 seconds, Mr. Drysdale said, okay, that is long enough. Now let us think about me and my bank. Miss Hathaway pleaded with him to be reasonable, pointing out that he would be safe in London in his accounting house, but those poor simple hill folk would suddenly find themselves cast adrift in a society so steeped in tradition, so rigid with protocol, that they would be completely lost. She argued that they would not know what to do or say or who to turn to. Mr. Drysdale smiled smugly and stated that they would turn to Lady Jane Hathaway, asking who else they would need. Miss Hathaway was stunned and repeated, Lady Jane Hathaway, me. Mr. Drysdale nodded vigorously and said, you, calling her chief and explaining that the Crown would never overlook her services in converting the peasants of Possum Ridge into the keepers of Clampett Castle. Miss Hathaway shook her head, saying, Chief, this is ridiculous. I could never expect such a thing. Mr. Drysdale then reminded her of her heritage, asking if she hadn't told him that her ancestors were English. Miss Hathaway admitted that her great-grandfather and others were, and Mr. Drysdale raised his hands dramatically, shouting, blood will tell. You belong in the castle, to the man of honor, Lady Jane Hathaway of Hathaway Hall. Miss Hathaway sighed deeply, repeating the words Hathaway Hall to herself, wondering if she was getting swept up in the fantasy too. Back at the mansion, Jed was sitting with Granny, discussing the whole situation very seriously. He looked at the paperwork and said, Mr. Gray, do you think we had better pass on this going to England business, because we do not belong in no castle? Mr. Drysdale, who had just walked in with Miss Hathaway, overheard this and cried out, "Oh, don't say that. Why, you will love Hathaway Hall, I mean Clampett Castle." Miss Hathaway looked at him sideways and reminded him, "You said," but Mr. Drysdale quickly whispered to her, "Oh, Chief, change your mind." She didn't have the complete picture. Miss Hathaway then addressed Jed, saying that she did feel he should investigate the situation, and that he might find that he would enjoy the English country